In this week's show, we dive into the River Thames with an amphibious truck that saw service in the Cold War. We roll with a Centurion tank, widely viewed as one of the most successful tank designs in the history of warfare. And the GMC 2.5-ton truck, used by all the Allied forces and the backbone of the push for Berlin. But first up, we join Dad's army on the home front and the Hillman Minx, the classic little car of World War II.
This particular one was built in 1937. It's a Hillman Minx Deluxe, which means it's larger, a bit more room in the back, and was built in Coventry. I bought it in 1999, but it was in poor condition, sills, rotten doors and things like that. And we looked at it, we wanted to do a World War II vehicle, as myself and another gentleman who helped me rebuild it. And instead of trying to restore it back to looking as perfect as it would have been, we decided to do it in a military one. So we've gone for this, and if you park this on a site anywhere, it looks 1940. It says World War II. It's even the colours of a Spitfire or a Hurricane. Engineering is very simple on a vehicle like this. It was a tried and trusted unit. It's 1200 cc's, which in this day and age means 55 miles per hour on the M25, and it does about sort of 25 to the gallon, which is not bad going with the carburettor tuned. It's a Solex carburettor. It's very, very simple. It's just 4 cylinders. There's nothing complicated under there, and of course you can start it with a cranking handle, and that's the one that the children they come along and they think, what on earth is he doing? Why is he winding the car up? And it goes beautifully like that. It's only got 6-volt electrics, which makes it a bit interesting when you step on the brakes because nobody can see the lights, and the lights are very poor. Motorists these days don't understand the trafficators, which are the little arms that pop up out of the side. So those are the hazards of driving it, but it is a very simple vehicle, and spare parts seem to be readily available at the moment. But when you see them, then you buy them, and since it's been here this weekend, this week, I've had offers. I've got this for it, would you like that? Some of the old gentlemen who drove them when they were young men, so that's rather nice, keeping it going. They filled a gap. Obviously, with petrol rationing coming in, you had motorists had to take their vehicles off the road. All sorts of legislation was brought in which made it difficult for the motorist. It was downright dangerous. In fact, pedestrians, it was very lethal for. So these cars were taken up. Some were built for contract for the services. Others were taken up from private ownership, which this would have done. This actually spent the Blitz in London in 1940-41. And then they were given a coat of military paint. It was an offence for a civilian, in fact, to have a camouflage car, I found out recently. And then they would whiz around between, say, on an airfield or something like that, moving around, or a naval base, moving papers around, transporting officers around, picking up anything and everything. They were a little cog that whizzed around. Well, with the Wrens, nice young ladies joined the ladies' armed services. Most girls then, it sounds rather sort of things so to say, they didn't know how to drive at that point. They learned to drive in vehicles like this. The ATS, which was the army version, and then the WAFs. And the girls came in, and when they came in as a driver, they released a man to go off and do perhaps something a little bit more brutal. In other words, they released a soldier for the front, I suppose, one way of putting it. The Wrens were very elegant getting in and out of one of these things. We're not going to go down the line of black stockings or anything, but I've seen photographs of them and spoken to some of the ladies, and they looked absolutely spot on when they were doing it. A lot of the girls came from good class backgrounds. They would have, if they could drive, they would have learnt to drive in a car like this. And the classic photographs is of these vehicles made into a little pickup truck, and Princess Elizabeth, as she was then, learned to drive and maintain one of these. And in 1995, one of these vehicles was produced, an exact replica for her to look at when they drove down the Mall in the victory celebrations. I've taken this out on when it was originally, before it was camouflaged up, and 2 old gentlemen came over me and he said, I actually learnt to drive in a car like this. And then went on to describe the hazards of the doors. They're called suicide doors because they slam back and you could fall out and things like that. But it's a vehicle they recognise and they feel comfortable with. And if they remembered, say with the military vehicles here, this is an easy car to drive, and it's a very comfortable car to drive. The windscreen even opens up, the odd fly comes in, but it's nice. And I think it's when you've seen something that you enjoyed as a young person, that makes you, and perhaps you're a bit old and crotchety now, I think that's a nice sort of bit of nostalgia for you on the more practical side of things. 60-something odd years old and still going strong, and a very proud little beast it is.
Next up, the six-wheel drive amphibious truck that saw service in the Cold War along the Rhine. The Alvis Stalwart.
Driving them on the road is very, to say the least, interesting. You can either end up very quickly up the curb or in the oncoming traffic if you're not careful, because the inherent design fault that was put into Stalwart, they weave. Because of the way the drive system's set up, both sets of wheels are trying to outpace one another. So you get this weaving effect, and when you're driving it on the road, it's either sort of, you've got to keep overcorrecting it all the time, and they are very hard work to drive on the road. The concentration level, you know, if you drive for more than a couple of hours, your eyes are like out on stalks where you've been trying to sort of constantly correct it. Yeah, so they're very interesting drive on the road. Great fun. Does about 40 mile an hour flat out, which is fast enough when you're weaving all over the place. The greatest fun really is to sort of drive along the side on the road, a queue of traffic behind us, and the Stalwart in front was all ready to go into the water, and he just turned right and went straight down the slipway, straight in the river, and the people beyond were just, you know, a study.
When I got it, it had been sitting in a field for probably 12 years, so the paintwork was pretty grim, and I got it sandblasted to just tidy it up, because if I took it home the way it was, my wife would go absolutely ape. And so I just had it in primer, and I thought, oh, it actually looks quite nice in a light grey. Maybe I'll have it white, because I've been in the army and I've done the green thing, and I'm not really bothered with it, but I love the thing as a piece of engineering. It's a lovely bit of kit. Unfortunately, mine was one of the ones that had been had all the swim gear removed, because when they, in the sort of mid-80s, it was deemed that they weren't needed to be amphibious anymore, and so when they went in for a service or a base overhaul, they had all the swim gear removed, and which mine did, and I had to find all the bits to make it work again, which consists of, I found a place on Salisbury Plain that had a whole load of scrap ones there, and we just dismantled the bits off them and brought it all home, and it's taken me probably 5 years to get it up to here, and today's the day when we see if it's sink or swim.
Right, I suppose we better...
His mate Anthony was on hand for all the final checks.
Is that first bung okay? Let's get that, double check that. The reason why it has bungs is when the vehicle's parked outside, if we get a heavy downfall of rain, you've then got 200 or 300 gallons of water inside. Left-hand door,
Locking handle
locked.
okay?
That's it, make sure the locking pin's in. Seal's okay. Rear panel.
Okay.
Sit nice and tight, lovely. Right, back door, locked. Okay. That seems pretty sound, doesn't it?
I'll just go and check the...
Okay, yeah, just last check the winch case.
The winch compartment drain plug.
The first time you go in the water is actually quite a frightening thing. It's quite disconcerting. Although you're confident with the work that you've done, and you obviously keep your fingers crossed you haven't left anything out, it is an unusual feeling because it's basically a lorry. Should it float? I don't know. It just seems natural. It goes in, the front end of it lifts up, and next minute you're afloat.
Amazing. After all these years.
Hang on a minute.
Turn like that. Turn on the
Underneath the floor, that's a Rolls-Royce B81 petrol, which is an 8-cylinder, 6.5 litre straight 8. which is the wrong way round actually, and drive into a 5-speed gearbox, into a transfer box, and then the drive comes out from the transfer box sideways, and then forwards and backwards inside the hull, and then through bevel boxes out through to the wheels. So it's very, very complicated drive system. The water propulsion system drives off the top of the gearbox, and on a PTO, through these prop shafts, into these bevel joints, and then across these shafts here, and then into the actual jet drives, which are these there and there. And that's what's actually provides the thrust for driving in the water. It's an absolute nightmare to work on, because you'll end up in all sorts of contorted positions. But I've spent many a happy hour fiddling around with the old girl, and you know, they're great fun.
Virtually all the vehicles in the 60s were produced to be amphibious, because the idea was if the Russians came, the first thing that would be knocked out would be the bridges. They were mainly used as artillery limbers. The engineers used them for carrying stores and stuff across rivers, but mainly the artillery and the tank corps used them for carrying fuel and ammunition, because they'll go anywhere a tank will go. And of course the high top, and they could load straight onto a, you know, Centurion deck, you know, for fueling, etc. So they were quite useful.
When you're driving on the road, people sort of always just sort of, you know, as you go past, think, what the hell's that? You know? So, yeah, I mean, you've got to be a bit mad, I suppose, to own one, but there you go. You've got to do something, haven't you?
Coming up in part 2, the backbone of the Allied supply lines in World War II, the GMC truck. But first up, the Centurion main battle tank was designed at the end of the Second World War. The prototype appearing in 1945, with production commencing soon after. They saw action in Korea, Vietnam, Pakistan, and the Middle East. Nearly 4,500 were produced before production ceased in 1962, when the Chieftain replaced it. It is considered one of the most successful tank designs in the history of warfare, and many are still in service today with foreign armies.
It's similar in some respects to a Chieftain. There's a lot more room inside. It's not kind of mechanical with electric servos pushing it. It's just big mechanical rods, and in some respects, although it's a little bit heavier to drive and the gearbox is, you know, takes some practice, in actual fact, it's probably more durable than a Chieftain. They certainly push harder. At Sherborne-Ness, they still use them for pulling hard targets in and out. And I mean, some of these things are like 50, 60 years old, and they'll run better than a modern Chieftain or Challenger. They'll be much more reliable. They've not got an auto box, so you've got less chance of burning it out and messing it up. And of course, when you get salt and rain and crap like that, when you've got electronics pushing servos and things, it's just a recipe for disaster. They reckon a tank battle lasts 2 hours, and a tank only engaged the enemy 3 times. So potentially you've got like 6 hours use on a tank and chuck it away. So they never really put a lot of longevity into it.
Nick bought a Centurion that was refitted as a demolition Avri for the Royal Engineers. While it is one of his favourite tanks, it had a few teething problems.
The Centurion Avri, I bought it in an army sale about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was a good idea at the time, but basically the day they were made, they were poor starters. Unless you run them every day, and you've got magnetos, booster coils, starter motors, all very, very weak, all very, very problematic. But electronic ignition is the way forward, and the only difference is one little wire coming out of a magneto onto a 12-volt supply. So it still looks the part inside, but it'll start and stop just like it should.
It's absolutely amazing. There's nothing that I've ever known like it, that you are in control of something this size, you know, this amount of power and the capabilities that it's had. It's very difficult to say that, you know, I have a favourite tank over any other, because there's such a variety of them. You know, it can be like driving a Mini to a Formula One car. Each does different things, each has different capabilities. This year I got to drive this for the first time, and it was absolutely awe-inspiring. It was brilliant. I mean, I was being told to shut up for weeks afterwards because it's all I would talk about, that I've driven a Centurion, and, you know, it was just, every time I mentioned it, it was like, no, go and sit in the corner and be quiet. We've had enough about Centurions. But it was just amazing, something, the size and the power of this, and the noise and the, you know, the vibrations as you're going along that it generates. And it's just, there's no real words to describe it. It's just absolutely nothing compared to this. It is, you know, it's just like somebody's, I don't know, stuck a rocket inside your head and blown it apart. It's amazing. You just can't think straight for a while afterwards.
You know what they say about Scotsmen and their kilts? It's the same with Scots women.
There's two ways of driving. Obviously, like when you drive a normal manual gearbox on your car, you use your clutch, you press the clutch to change gear. With Centurion, you don't. When you're a proper Centurion driver, you use the steering stick to change gear. So you'll drive along in one gear, and then on the overrun, you take your foot off the accelerator pedal, pop it into neutral, and then you'll feel a little twitch. And that's when you yank the steering lever up, which stops the gearbox, and you can just slot it into the next gear. That's the theory of it. So that's what we were trying.
Goes well. We went bombing down that straight. It started to have a bit of soul, the old girl. It was good. Impressed, very impressed.
If you want a tank with a lot of history, buy something that's absolutely knackered. And then that way it's probably seen a lot of life. And when you spend your £10 at one of these museums and they pull all the army records and trace it, sometimes you get quite a shock. But when you get something really nice and shiny and people are really proud of it and take it to the shows, they end up spending a tenner and all it says is British Army of the Rhine, and that's it, never seen any service. But this old girl was rough, I mean very rough, and it had like holes and marks all over it. And I could tell by some bits that had been welded on the top of the turret, some anchorage points, that it had used to have reactive armour. So I knew it had been in the Gulf War, but it turned out it led the attack in Suez in '56. Not many tanks nowadays have got suspension on the rear, but the Centurion, it did have rear suspension, so when the ground gets really rough, you can go a lot faster, and you can also take hills easier. It's surprising, but in the Gulf War, apparently, when these breached the sandbanks that the Iraqis had built, all the Allies come steaming through with Challengers and Abrams and that, and it wasn't long before this old girl at sort of 18, 20 mile an hour, rattling along, was sort of overtaking them. You know, one steaming, one smoking, one stuck in the mud, just keeps rattling along.
In 1940, Hitler made his great bid for the domination of Europe. His armies smashed across the borders of the Netherlands, Belgium, France. 4 years later, American wheels started rolling through the cities of France, rolling east towards Berlin. This is the Red Ball Express.
The Red Ball Express was the nickname for the supply route that sustained the Allied forces' push to Berlin. The backbone of this was the GMC 2.5-ton truck.
This vehicle is an American GMC 353, which means it's a long wheelbase version of the American wartime truck. Basically, they were built in 1940 to 1945 purely for the war, but the basic variant you see is the one here, which is the supply come troop carrier. It was in every single theatre of the war, absolutely everything. These vehicles were the backbone of the American transport. On the bonnet you've got a 4.5 litre petrol engine, top speed 45 mile an hour.
This one-way highway is a revolution in the science of military supply. Over it, in a never-ending stream, thousands of American trucks are highballing to victory.
During the war, everyone had to make something. If you had some sort of manufacturing plant, whether you were making lawnmowers or hair dryers, in the end you were pushed into making something for the war effort. And these were made by everyone, really. A truck like this, it's quite handy because it's HGV exempt, so if anyone wants to drive one, you can drive it on a normal car licence, and you haven't got to worry about your MOT every year. Best to have a practice on a bit of field first though, because the steering lock is pretty horrendous, and the steering wheel is about 5 feet across. You don't need power steering after 6 months of driving there. You've got biceps like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Oh, change gear, crash box. Driving these is a f***ing nightmare, I tell you. It's alright downhill with the following wind because it gives you more time to concentrate on the gears. It's when you're going uphill and when you put your foot on the clutch you start to slow down quicker. It's quite difficult. It can be four-wheel on the rear drive, which is 8 wheels, or it can be all-wheel drive, high or low. We've never got it stuck, so they must be pretty good. You can bolt 2 extra wheels and tyres on the 2 front wheels to give it a little bit more traction, but we've never needed it yet. The value of something like this, I would think it would be worth less than £2,000. There's still quite a lot around. You see them advertised in these magazines, and you nip over to Belgium and there's a yard with hundreds of them all lined up, all sort of shiny, and spares as well. When the Americans make anything, they make millions and millions of tons of spares, and anything you want is brand new, 50 years old in waxed paper. You can still get everything.